Good afternoon and welcome to Georgetown, Qatar. On behalf of Georgetown University in Qatar, it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's talk featuring Georgetown University Distinguished Professor in the Practice of Diplomacy and the Director of the University's Institute for the Study of Diplomacy, Ambassador Barbara Boudin. As a campus offering the same degree as Georgetown School of Foreign Service in Washington, D.C., it's always a pleasure to welcome our counterparts to the Qatar campus. We often have a unique perspective to share with our Washington, D.C. guests because of our location in the heart of the Middle East and the body of research that we produce about the region. But today's guest has a history of her own living and working in the region, and it is her significant lived experience during some of the biggest events that shaped the modern Middle East that informs today's talk: diplomacy in an era of disruption, discontinuity, and discord. Ambassador Boudin spent over 30 years in the U.S. Foreign Service, engaging primarily with issues related to the Arabian Peninsula and Greater Persian Gulf, such as U.S. bilateral and regional policy, strategic security issues, counterterrorism, and governance and reform. Her first assignments in the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs was a country officer for the two Yemens and security assistance coordinator for the peninsula. Ambassador Boudin went on to serve in Baghdad as a deputy principal officer during the Iran-Iraq War in the late 1980s, and Kuwait as deputy chief of mission during the Gulf War when Iraq invaded and occupied the country through the 1990-1991 period. She was appointed as ambassador to the Republic of Yemen from 1997 to 2001, where she helped enhance support for democratization and increased cooperation between the U.S. and Yemen on security and counterterrorism. After the Iraq War, where Saddam Hussein was overthrown in 2003, she was seconded to the Department of Defense in Iraq as the senior State Department official and the first coalition coordinator for reconstruction in Baghdad and the central governance. Since leaving the government, Ambassador Boudin has been founding director of the Governance Initiative in the Middle East and senior fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government and the Robert Wilhelm Fellow at MIT's Center for International Studies. Prior to joining Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, she spent 7 years at Princeton University teaching and directing policy task forces and policy workshops on U.S. diplomacy in the Persian Gulf region. Your Excellency, Ambassador Boudin, thank you so much for coming today and sharing your wealth of experience with us. You have experienced firsthand many wars and significantly disruptive events, which have great resonance with the events of the day. I know I speak for everyone here when I say how much I look forward to hearing your unique perspectives on diplomacy in an era of disruption, discontinuity, and discord. After your speech, we will have a short question and answer session, which you have generously offered to moderate. So please join me in welcoming Ambassador Boudin.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be here. I have to say that coming in from the airport the other day, I come back to the Gulf and I start to feel at home again. So despite my history, it's someplace I always look forward to visiting and I miss very much. So thank you so much for the opportunity to visit Doha again, to conduct a workshop for the last several days with people from a number of your ministries, and certainly for this opportunity to speak at our sister campus here in Doha. It's also very nice to see some old friends. I will try very hard not to speak for the whole hour, because I want to hear your questions and your comments. So please do share. The global order that arose from the rubble of the Second World War created an international structure that has worked very well for the most part. We have avoided a third global conflagration. We have seen the end of colonialism and the last remnants of empire. Over 1 billion people have been able to rise out of poverty, and there are new, vibrant middle classes, levels of education available to women and men, and political empowerment within and between states that was unimaginable in 1945. Regional and multilateral bodies seek to deal with the plethora of issues that confront humanity everywhere: peace, justice, security, the plight of refugees and oppressed minorities, the well-being of children, non-proliferation, chemical biological weapons, terrorism and violent extremism in all of its guises, genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, trade, economies, and increasingly issues related to our environment. New conventions and agreements continue to expand and extend the rules-based order. A globalized economy and the hyperconnectiveness of new technologies, I did be sure to turn off my own phone, hyperconnectiveness of new technologies weave us together in ways that we still don't fully comprehend and we don't know quite how to manage effectively. The world is, in short, substantially better. It is more prosperous, more peaceful, and more just most of the time, in most places, and for most people. However, these structures and these norms and these considerable advances, as well as the promise of the new economic order and the new technologies, have not served all peoples equitably. The benefits have not been shared equally either within societies or between countries. The decrease in interstate violence has been set off by ongoing or worsening intrastate violence, too often exploited and fueled by outside parties with agendas that have very little to do with the legitimate local grievances, nor are they interested in initiatives to create a better post-conflict society. The very economic ties and technologies we thought would bring us together have been weaponized, used as coercive tools of statecraft. In what may become an economic circular firing squad of actions and reactions not seen since the 1930s, trade and economics have also been used more as a weapon than a bridge. Sanctions, embargoes, blockades use the new interdependence of economics to punish rather than to advance. A sense of marginalization, disenfranchisement, and disillusionment that have some very real roots in both economic maldistribution, changing economic needs, such as the end of coal or the rise of robots, and the concentration of power, are felt everywhere. In sharp reaction to the promises of globalization has been the rise of nativism, the ugly cousin to populism. If national pride and populism, which I define as a focus on the needs and the aspirations of the people, are positive and uplifting forces, nativism seeks not to advance, but to exclude, not to share, but to covet, and not to build, but to destroy. It is narcissism and victimization, real or imagined, on a collective scale. And it manifests itself in many ways. It is the closing of borders, the denial of legitimate asylum, the exclusion of desperate refugees, and the demonization and thus the violence towards the other. We saw it at the Christchurch Mosque, and we've seen it in Sri Lankan churches. We've seen it in synagogues in Pittsburgh and the Yellow Jackets in Paris. Nativism atomizes societies and states through the political exploitation of fear. Together with its economic sibling, protectionism, it rejects multilateralism, multiculturalism, and the very structures that were built painstakingly over decades to secure the common weal. New technologies bear particular scrutiny. These technologies include the explosion of media in many forms that heralded a marketplace of ideas and accountability of both governments and the private sector, while effectively breaking down barriers between peoples. That promise, too, has seen its betrayals, or at least the stunning naivete of its creators. Technologies, as we have seen, can divide as well as unite. They can foster corrosive tribalism of linking only to your own kind. They have given voice to the oppressed and exposed the corrupt, but they have also allowed the ugly side of human nature to find a powerful voice and to create an equally ugly community. The Christchurch killer's affinity with white supremacists worldwide, including in my own country, and his use of social media to revel in his atrocity is one horrible example. Sri Lanka's decision to shut down social media following the Easter bombings is equally a reflection of the power of this new technology and our imperfect steps to figure out how to contain the contagion. These new technologies have also been weaponized by states, as well as these non-state actors. They have been effectively used to stigmatize people, to sow distrust and fear, and therefore this hatred. They are used to monitor and suppress dissent, and they have been used to seek to bring down political and economic structures, the very sovereignty of states, without even having to fire a shot. Fake photos of weapons of mass destruction, denial of military actions, fabricated videos, and certainly the efforts to hijack elections and distort referenda. More than cybersecurity or hybrid warfare, there is a new cyber arms race going on, and the implications of this we still don't know, and we do not know how to control. As a further complication, there's been the added proliferation of power centers beyond the nation state. I have heard for decades how the nation state would be subsumed by regional and multilateral bodies, such as the EU, and by the mega multinationals. It didn't quite work that way, or at least not solely. While the conventional wisdom was to look up to see challenges to the nation state, there were trends operating below that may prove equally complicating. There are, of course, the non-state actors, but there's also the rise of the new city-states, the mega places where populations, economics, and therefore political power increasingly concentrate and can actually dwarf that of the host state within which it operates. There has been over the past decades and recently accelerating trend towards urbanization and this conflict and this concentration of power. In a few decades, upwards of 75% of the world's population is going to live in cities, not in the rural areas. They, much like regional and multilateral bodies, are not an alternative to the nation state, so much as they operate in parallel to, sometimes in collaboration or cooperation with, and sometimes and increasingly in opposition to their central authorities. The power of California to stand in credible opposition to Washington on such issues as the Paris Accords is an example of this. What this multiplicity of players, some benign, some not, some partners, some not, what they do indicate is that the multiplicity of issues that we all face outstrip the ability of any nation state, or perhaps even any collective of them, who operate through conventional political structures. It outstrips their ability to address these new challenges. The clearest example of this is perhaps what most of us clearly understand is the major existential threat, the major disruptor of the global order. And it's not a country, it is not an ideology or a cause, and it's not the rise of the autocrats. It is climate change. The change in climate due to man-made intervention over the decades is beyond any state, any city, any corporation, anyone to solve through conventional means. It has and it will reshape the world in which we live and how we're able to live. It will drive major diplomatic challenges well into the future. It is the source of pandemics, resource conflict, water, food security, migration and refugees. It is not an others problem, and it's not an elsewhere problem. It is something that we all have to deal with and we all have to reckon with. It will, and it already has, open new areas of contestation, the Arctic most notably, the most significant change to global trade patterns since the opening of the Panama Canal, and an increasing area of global political and economic competition. And if we acknowledge the climate, the environment, and the world to be our greatest challenge now and going forward, diplomacy is going to have to work more closely and collaboratively with yet a significant new player, science. Unless we understand the implications of the current changes, we will not be able to devise workable, multinational, cross-national, governmental, or corporation policies. There needs to be a deliberate nexus between science, policy, and diplomacy. Science provides the route for policymakers and diplomats to study issues, collect and understand data, and determine patterns and trends. Science can speak a common language and offer common sense, evidence-based, data-driven solutions beyond the heated rhetoric of politics. Science and policy, the scientist and the diplomat, need to learn to speak a common language, to cross cultural divides for common purpose, much as diplomats see their role to cross cultural divides between countries and societies. There is no need to declare that the old order is dead, or even that it is necessarily dying, as some have already done. But it will need to adapt and change to these new realities. The challenge for diplomacy and for diplomats will be how to navigate these new realities, this new world, in ways that preserve the benefits of the order that has evolved since 1945, and to help policymakers devise ways to mitigate, if not reverse, the inequities of that order that threaten its very survival. The challenge for diplomacy and for diplomats is not how to freeze the world order at some magical place of imagined peace, order, and security and justice that never really fully existed, but to be part of the adaptation for this future. Can common efforts that address common shared interests, collaborative engagement, be sustained in this evolving order? Are there new ways to address and correct the unfulfilled promises of globalization within and between states, to extend and expand the benefits and to mitigate the costs? Or will we consign ourselves to a zero-sum Hobbesian future of the new nativist autocrats? Enhanced trade opportunities and domestic prosperity have long been the functions of diplomacy. Strong economies are the hallmark of and precursors to power and influence internationally, and perhaps the bulwark against instability and conflict. A shared stake in an economic order would strengthen a shared stake in the political order and the interdependencies inherent in economic globalization, the weaving together of supply chains and economies of scale. These were assumed to mitigate the threat of trade wars and actual conflict. While that assumption has been sorely tested, stress tested is the current phrase, it does actually seem to be holding. A shared sense of common threats was once the foundation of the old order. And there was a sense that with the end of the Cold War, that common threat is why it has frayed, that a complacency set in. Sorry, I'll take care of that in a minute. Sorry, I am literally standing up here falling apart. Sorry about that. Anyway, that there was a complacency because at the end of the Cold War, we won. And thus, we allowed the world order to operate on autopilot without looking at where it was working and where it was not working. We had a failure of imagination. But might there be other equally existential threats? The malignant social media and its weaponization against both societies and states, and the realities of the rapidly accelerating and destructive climate change and those consequences on habitation, agriculture, food, water, and pandemics. Could this be the new unifying theme for the international order going forward? Former Secretary of State Dean Acheson famously entitled his memoirs, "Present at the Creation." Some have already questioned, are we now present at the destruction? I think our challenge is, how do we shape a new stage for this world order that we all share so that it works? We need to be present at a new creation or a new rebirth. Diplomats will need to be conversant, if not specialists, in fields not even known yet. I was having brunch with two of my former students who graduated about 10 years ago, and they are both working in fields that did not exist when they were going to school. We need to understand that our students will be working in a world that we cannot imagine. They must continue to be well-grounded in history, for history is present and it is part of the future. They must be well-grounded in economics, trade, finance, and they must be able to work and talk with the scientists. They must understand their writ is not confined to government, but must include the private sector, civil society, and all other elements of state and society. But beyond their appreciation for the role of history and an understanding of current threats, challenges, and dynamics, diplomacy and its practitioners of the future will need to have the intellectual and personal skills that will give them the ability to think deeply about the roots and the consequences of their immediate problem, that allow them to think broadly about partners as they work to understand and deal with issues, and most importantly, that gives them the intellectual skills and the personal integrity to think and act courageously, to dare to think differently, to adapt and evolve and grow as quickly as these changes appear. As one person put it at a recent conference I attended, diplomats, as well as the rest of us, will have to be able to work at the speed of relevance. I know you all can do that. Good luck. Thank you.
You spoke about challenges facing diplomats, and I tend to believe that some of the very difficult challenges facing diplomats is to follow instructions and implement policies that they do not sometimes agree with or believe in. And currently, the policies of the US in the Middle East is something that contradicts what they actually publicly speak of everywhere else about democracy and human rights, et cetera, et cetera. How do you reconcile or cope or try to make these two contradictions work?
That's an excellent question. And while I will certainly admit, concede that it is an increasingly relevant question, it's one that I think diplomats and all public servants must face. It is, as I will explain to students, with the best of administrations, with the best of leadership, there will be policies and there will be decisions that you disagree with. I think I worked for 7 or 8 presidents, and I don't know how many secretaries of state of both parties. And I spent most of my career either in or working on this part of the world. And there were, many times, there were policies I disagreed with. Part of being a public servant is your job is to provide policymakers with the best information and the best analysis that you can. And if you're in an embassy, you are providing the ground truth, reality, at least as you see it. And you are advising Washington or London or Doha, what are the implications of policy decisions being made. If you're in Washington or any ministry, your job is to take that information and make policy recommendations. And I will assure you that there are quite often extremely active debates on what the policy should be or what the program should be. Where should we be going? Why should we be going there? How should we get there? And there are many times when you will lose. And I will admit that I've fought vociferously sometimes for certain policies, and I lost the policy debate. And in retrospect, I was wrong, and the other policy was actually a better policy. So a little humility goes a long way if you're working. There is an issue of, I think, loyalty. Even if I'm working for a university, I will tell you that there are some times when there have been policy decisions within the university that I thought were very wrong-headed. I made my voice very clear, and then the policy decision was made, and my responsibility as a senior member of the university is to follow that policy as decided, and that was my responsibility as a public servant as well. There is always the question of if the policy or the principles behind it are such that you find it intolerable given your own integrity or your own principles or your own morals. And that question does come up. I was in Washington at the beginning of the Yugoslav war when my government was taking no action against what we now call ethnic cleansing. And it was an extraordinarily difficult time for many of us. We've cared very deeply about this. There were 5 officers on the Yugoslav desk who were at ground zero for this debate. 2 of them chose to resign on a matter of principle, and I deeply respect that decision. And once having resigned, they went to the media and made it very clear why they thought it was wrong and why they chose to leave. And that's fine, and that's good, and I respect that. The others stayed, not because they thought the policy was good or that they liked it or it didn't bother their morals. It did. They chose to stay and chose to continue to push and push for a change. And ultimately we did. We finally did the right thing. I think there is a lot to be said about what is the greater intellectual and personal courage to leave, which sometimes you have to, or to stay and continue to fight. And there is no easy answer, and I cannot give my students, this is the simple red line, and once you reach it, that's it. Another example that many people bring up is Ryan Crocker, who is one of our most senior diplomats. And as we were getting geared up to go into Iraq in 2003, there were a lot of people who knew this region who said that this is a fundamental, tragic, consequential mistake. Don't do it. And Ryan very famously wrote a memo where he outlined this is what is going to happen if you do this. And And it went all the way up to the president. And the president decided to go into Iraq anyway. And unfortunately, most of Ryan's predictions, which were shared by many of us, came true. Ryan, if he had quit at that point, everyone would have understood and accepted and respected him. He chose to stay. And at a certain point, the president realized how bad the mistakes were. And as you might recall, there was the reset. And the two most vociferous opponents of why we went in, how we went in, and what we did the day after or not were David Petraeus and Ryan Crocker. And they were both ultimately sent to Baghdad. I think, unfortunately, they both got there too late, but they were there to try to manage the problem. Many of my colleagues in the State Department right now are facing the same kind of dilemmas, where we are seeing a lot of policies and a lot of actions being taken that are extraordinarily difficult. The decision to cut all of our assistance to Central American countries in the misguided sense that somehow this is going to take care of the refugee problem, which is completely backwards. When we were threatening to rain fire and fury down on North Korea and what this would have meant for our allies in South Korea and Japan. Unfortunately, with this administration, I'm not a part of the government anymore, so I can say this, too much of this administration has been making some cataclysmically bad decisions. And certainly, from my point of view, the decisions that have been made regarding Israel and the Palestinians have been some of the worst. We have now recognized annexation of territory taken by force, Golan. We have now taken the question of the status of Jerusalem off the table. We have now declared the Palestinians no longer refugees. Therefore, the right of return is off the table. And if anybody wants to bet that Netanyahu is not going to try to annex the settlements, please let me know. I'd love to make that bet because I know I will win. He will. These are deeply wrong decisions, along with many others. From my point of view, my background is, my focus has been Yemen for most of my career, and our support for the Saudis in Yemen is about as wrenching a thing that I've ever watched, because it is a country I know and care about, and it should be wrenching to anybody. So the question becomes, do you stay and try to push and push and push and hope that it will be balanced, it will be mitigated? And this is something that I tell to many of my students who have become diplomats and are very junior, is that somebody needs to stay, learn the trade, be part of the conversation, because this will end, and we are going to have the professionals in the service, in the embassies, knowing the region, to be able to try to correct some of these mistakes. But that's a hard decision.
Thank you. My name is Sadiq Abu Nafisa. I work for the Center for Strategic Studies, Armed Forces. Thanks for this important lecture, and thanks to Georgetown University also for this interesting event. I think diplomacy, it has been gone or has taken the second seat, or the back seat after 1990, when the New World Order declared by President Bush. 1990, he declared the New World Order. And that New World Order actually started with the invasions and destruction of countries, and even ended something called, or a principle called, state sovereignty. Mm-hmm. That has also one of the results of this New World Order. And unfortunately, the United States, the strongest state on earth, is actually the pioneering country in this respect of, wars and miseries and many
Okay.
things. The other point, sorry if you don't mind, is that common threats today are more than, in the old world.
Yes.
Order,
Yes.
Old world, يعني. So, and also these common threats, unfortunately, I must say also, coming from, not from the developing world. It's
Right.
not from the
Right.
underdeveloped world or developing countries, but also it's for advanced countries.
Okay. In respect to others who have questions, can I ask you to come to a question so that I can answer your question, and then I can let others also ask questions?
The question is that talking about diplomacy today, I
Right.
don't think it's there. It is the power that works.
Okay, well, that, I will disagree with that. Power is certainly important, but it is not the same thing as leadership. I will agree with you, not 1990, but I would say because I think in 1990 with George Bush's somewhat optimistic New World Order, that diplomacy actually became more important because we were not looking to solve things militarily. But I will say that with his son in 2003, we did shift to a more military-led policy, and diplomacy did take a back seat. That, first of all, to kind of go back to the first question, the diplomats stayed because there is always a critical need for diplomacy. The downside of diplomacy is that we don't show very much. Military action is very glitzy. It photographs better, and it tends to be far more dramatic, and the work of diplomats is very quiet. It is not dramatic, and the better diplomats do their job, the even less people see us because we have resolved a conflict before it became violent. We've mitigated a conflict before it got out of control, and we negotiated an end to a conflict. So we don't show very much. We know that. I was recently at a conference, spent a lot of time at conferences, where the whole paradigm on how we deal with fragile states and post-conflict states, which, you're quite right, since our invasion of Iraq has been very military-led with diplomacy and development in poor second. There is now a flip back to diplomacy, that understanding that if you do not have the what I tell my students, if you don't know the why of what you're doing, and you don't know the who with whom you're doing it, you can't possibly figure out the what and the how. And so diplomacy, it gets quiet. We sometimes don't get as much recognition as we ought to, but diplomacy, not just for the United States, but for other states. And I think the role of this country with small state diplomacy, if I can borrow from one of your most esteemed professors, diplomacy is what allows state sovereignty to exist and countries to maintain their independence and to move their agendas forward. And this is why I say I don't think diplomacy is in the least bit dead or overtaken. You look at how the small states of the Pacific and the Caribbean came together, formed coalitions, got themselves smart, and drove a lot of the Paris Accord because they understood that climate change was going to affect them first and worst. So diplomacy is not going away. Power does not equal, where's Rudy? Had to listen to this for the last 3 days in my crisis management course. Power is not leadership. Power is the ability to coerce. Leadership is the ability to persuade. And I think that those who believe that being the most powerful means that you are the leader are mistaken. Power without any leadership is just simply a bully. And if you are simply coercing people to go along, I think all of you either were children, probably, may have children, that if you coerce them into doing something, they may do it while you're looking at them, and the minute you stop looking, they go back to what they wanted. If you're able to convince them why they should do something, and it's in their interest to do it, and it's because of your relationship, you've got a much better chance of changing their mind. So power and leadership are not the same. I would say, if I had written a much longer remark, that I do think that we, the United States, are losing a lot of our leadership because we have lost a lot of our ability to persuade on the basis of a vision and ideas that we used to support and we used to exemplify. We were always imperfect in how we managed our principles and our ideals. We didn't always live up to them at home. We didn't always live up to them abroad. But we had core principles and we had core values, and people recognized that, and we sought to work with. We, to the extent that we helped build this world order that has done good, imperfectly, it's because we were working with partners. You know, nobody was forced to join the international order at the point of a gun. They wanted to be part of it. We are losing that, and I will admit to that. And I think we have an administration that doesn't actually care about leadership, but does care about power, and doesn't understand that power without leadership is not going to last.
Thank you very much
Yes.
indeed for your presentation. Madam Ambassador, I'm Minister Counsel of the Russian Embassy. And I understand only too well what you've been talking about, because sometimes in the capacity of a public servant, of course, you have to promote most of all the interests of your state. But individually, you might perceive some of things differently. But a different story. When I retire, I do hope I would have opportunities to talk about that in more detail. Okay, so you just mentioned that tragic event, the bombing in Yugoslavia. I happened to be at that time also in Washington, D.C., affiliated with the U.S. Institute of Peace, and I do remember Dick Holbrook. And of course, by the way, the Yugoslavia event was the first one which made Russians real disenchanted with the United States. And that's when Russians started thinking that the world, the post-Soviet world, was not safe, et cetera, et cetera. But however, my question is, you know, we've been in a situation which is very, very bizarre. Two presidents, I mean the presidents of the United States and of Russia, they talk much about improving their relationships, the relationship between these two countries, but nothing happens. My question is, do you see any perspectives under the current leadership of both countries for improving the relations between Russia and the United States? Thank you very much indeed.
Well, first of all, it's a part of the world that I only know as just sort of a informed citizen. I was actually offered Russian language training once, and as a Southern Californian, I said I would take it only if they would send me places where it didn't snow. Yeah, I know. That would be a very limited career. Well, you're a diplomat. You know that all diplomats, you have to be an optimist. I've described diplomacy as you're an optimist with realism. And so you always believe that it can be made better, that it should be made better, and then you are realistic about what steps and how long that will take. If you only looked at the ladder, you would never get up in the morning and go to work. And if you only focused on the farmer, you would be frustrated at the end of every day. I would like to think, and I would hope that, you know, our two countries can find ways to work together far more effectively. But I think it's going to take changes probably in both our capitals for that to happen.
Thank you very much for that presentation and discussion. I don't come from the field, I come from museum studies. So I'm just thinking perhaps two questions, whether or not there is a trend across the world of social activism, as in people power, coming to the front and saying that these issues need to be sorted, the common thread that you mentioned earlier, and that this is something that governments have to listen to, that people are, you know, demonstrating, protesting in the street, making the voice heard, and this is something that I think people power can resonate on a bigger scale when we have these huge issues like climate change. We had the young lady that was talking from her own perspective, and she's become a sensation, you know.
Right.
So I think that young people with positivity can change the world. That's probably one of my questions about the optimism for social change from a public perspective, people power. And the second point is that, you know, if we think about diplomacy having done so many great things and we don't know about it, perhaps that's something that diplomacy needs to think about, because we need to understand that there is an importance for the global conditions that we have at the moment. Diplomacy is crucial, and we need to have some way internationally or in some respectful manner to show that diplomacy is important, because people are disenfranchised by politics and power and leader. And we need to see that ordinary people can make change for the better, but to see that there is other ways as well to enhance opportunities and fairness across the world. Thank you.
As I said, one of the problems of diplomacy is that the better we are at our job, the less it shows. And it's hard to make the case that because of what I did, we didn't have a war, or that we solved a problem. It's almost by definition, you know, we're consigned to only have our failures show. Sometimes there are great diplomats who are seen for what they're able to do, and perhaps, and some of them are a little bit better at the showman side. We will get credit if there is a peace accord, or if there is a major convention, such as the Paris Accords, the International Criminal Court, the Convention on the Banning of Landmines, you know, all of these structures that we've been talking about of the world order, the rules-based order, all of that came about because of diplomats. It was a bunch of diplomats sitting in rooms coming up with these agreements that address the needs and the demands of not just their governments, but their people. And they were able to craft something that was close enough to being workable that it survived. So we really do have a body of successes, but they become a success and somebody establishes the UN, and everyone kind of goes, well, of course. And you kind of go, no, there was no of course about creating the UN or any of the constituent elements. And it's also much easier to sit and say, well, it's a little inadequate here, and it's a little imperfect there, and it didn't work here. And you're kind of going, yes, but the alternative. We need to look at that. So, as I said, most of the time, most people, most places, but not always. The role of people power, you know, I don't think that that's new. It may have been magnified by social media, but if you look at most major change, whether it comes from the bottom up, I don't know, but it certainly comes from the middle out. Would probably be a better way. And when the voices are heard long enough and loud enough, there are governments who have found ways to block dissent, jail dissent, others, but most governments will listen. And certainly one of the reasons that we have always pushed for more open, transparent governance is so that voices can be heard. And that was a lot of our human rights and democratization efforts over decades, was to open up the political space so these kinds of voices could be heard. And I think that, you know, young people are now, you know, making a an appropriate amount of lot of noise about climate change is absolutely right. The one element that I find frustrating, though, sometimes looking at these social media-driven popular revolts, particularly the ones that are valid and legitimate, is that there is not a corresponding understanding of the need to how do you move that forward into policy? How do you make it constructive? It's one thing to stand outside and make the appropriate noises about that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong, do something. But then how do you take that into positive action? And one example of some people who I think did learn this lesson, and this was during the Paris climate talks, is they were interviewing a woman who is the head of some NGO having to do with climate change. You know, don't know which one. And she said, you know, when we used to come to these climate change conferences, we would demonstrate on the outside, and we would have conferences, and we would use social media, and we would do all this stuff to try to get everyone's attention. And we felt really good about what we were doing, but we weren't really having an impact. And she said, what we've been doing since, I guess it was since Kyoto, is we've started to figure out how to work with the policymakers and how to reach out to the corporations and make not just our ideas known and our views known, but work with them on what are solutions and make this thing a partnership and not just protest, but construct. And she said, and this was, I guess, after Paris was signed, and she said it worked. That there's always this talk about how politicians need to reach out to the popular vote. The popular vote needs to figure out a way to reach into the politics as well. We saw this in our last election, in our 2018 election, where a lot of people who saw protesting as the best form of political voice, and look what we got as president, and went back, and I remember talking to students afterwards. I said, fine, be upset, cry, get angry, all of that's great. Now go out and do something about it. And make sure that that people who share your views are on the city council and are in the state legislature. You know, all this kind of thing. If you don't like how corporations are operating, as long as it's not one that is so far beyond your principles, work within it to change it. And it's that engagement that has to be coming from that side as well. Because politicians are not extraterrestrials, much as people would like to sometimes think we are. They're not extraterrestrials, they're us. And so my argument back to the protesters is please protest, but then figure out how to be an effective practitioner to change the policies in ways that are institutionalized and move forward. And I think some of the, quote, leaderless protests, they're lovely, but they're not able to take it to the next step. And you end up with the counter-revolutionary forces who are organized being able to take it back. So you need to be involved. And to kind of one personal example on that, I started life as a sinologist, which counter to my grandmother's great fear and trepidation is not the study of sin. She was horrified. And this was during Vietnam. And so when I went into the Foreign Service, I had a lot of friends who were, how could you possibly work for the US government when you're spending all your time demonstrating against the war, which I did. And I said, well, look, I have this, you know, I love demonstrating against the war. It's great fun, except for the tear gas and a few other things. But I also get the feeling I'm not really making a big difference. I might have brought down a president, but how do I change this, really change this? And so I opted to go into the Foreign Service against a lot of criticism from my friends. At my first post in Hong Kong, there was a demonstration in front of the consulate against the Vietnam War, which is what I had been doing up until about 4 months earlier when I joined the Foreign Service. So I took a day off from work, and I joined the protest out front in my own building. Do not try this in your own career, unless you're really sure about. Needless to say, I got called into the Consul General's office first thing the next morning with a, we understand why you were doing this. Almost everybody in this building agrees with you that the war is wrong and, you know, all this stuff. But you really shouldn't be demonstrating in front of your own office building as a member of the government against your government. Now, he could have left it as almost, you know, you've lost your freedom of speech. You've lost your right to speak your voice. But he didn't. He took it one step further, which I've always remembered. He said, look, you now have the opportunity and actually the obligation to make your views known within the government. Few people have the opportunity you have now to try to shift that policy from the inside. And so I think some of you have children, you'll tell your children to use your inside voice. This is a kind of a different view of inside voice. Use your inside voice. And at that point, we didn't have the word empowered, but I felt very empowered by what I was doing. And so that's what I would say to the protesters, is find a way to have your inside voice.
I am a teacher. I am not a diplomat, neither a musician. I am very concerned about the new approach of your government toward Middle East again. As a politician, do you think the region can take another war? Because the horizon of another war is coming closer and closer. And I'm very concerned as a teacher what's going to happen.
I think many, oh, I'm sorry.
Do you think this region can take or can tolerate another?
No, I do not think this region can tolerate another war. And speaking to my own government, we haven't finished the first two we started. There should be a rule that you can only have no more than 2 ongoing wars in a region at a time. I'm sorry, that was very flippant. No, and I think everything should be done to try to keep that from happening. I am very concerned that there are forces, leaders, not just in Washington, but in the region, who see a conflict as an acceptable solution. And we have the war in Yemen, which is now in its 5th year, which was started recklessly, without regard to the people, without an understanding of who they are, that they would resist, and is now one of the biggest humanitarian catastrophes in the world. That should be a lesson to the region to step very carefully on this. I hope that, you know, the prognosis that we are heading for another war will be averted by wiser leaders, but I don't know. And it would be a tremendous conflagration. And this is a region that is still trying to build itself. There have been places such as this country that have made tremendous strides. Other countries who are working on getting to that level. There has been tremendous progress in the Middle East despite many of its backsliding. They can't afford another war. That decision is going to be made in capitals around here. And we will see how much social media and social protests can mitigate that. But the other side of being a diplomat is that you're part of the time optimist, but you have to be a pessimist. And in fact, you almost have to be a bit of a pessimist, because if you don't, you're not looking at what are the dangers. You have to be an optimist that you can solve them, but you have to be a pessimist about the reality. And I don't know if that's happening. I don't.
Hi, thank you. So I have 2 questions. The first one, you mentioned that the leadership over power being leadership, the persuading capacity over the coercive one. Do you think that in this persuading capacity is also the soft power of the country? And my second question will be, you mentioned also that right now the major disruptor of the global order is the climate change. And you have mentioned a lot about making your voice heard.
Right.
We know US policies. Can you mention a little bit about what's being done that we don't know to change that?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, one of the things that's being done on climate change on terms of voices is there's a lot of young people around the world who are making their voice very much heard that, we're going to inherit this mess. Please fix it before it's too much of a mess for us to be able to live. And I think that's important. One of the things that is interesting about the climate change debate is, yes, I do have a president who isn't even really quite sure there's climate change. I mean, this is a factless, scientistless, evidence-less approach to almost everything. Who's promised to keep coal going, anyway, you know all of that. And there is some damage being done, but what's interesting is that not just in the United States, but around the world, other people are stepping up. I mean, when we withdrew from the Paris Accords, which actually we haven't done yet formally, because it takes like 4 years to do it, so there's hope. But major states like California, New York, and others have said, fine, we're going to go ahead with the climate change. You go to small towns in the US, and they're moving their vehicles to electric. I live in a small town called Alexandria, Virginia, which is part of a big city, but we're a very small little town, and all of our buses are going electric. People are, I think I heard just the other day that the cost of solar and wind is now just about the same as gas and less than coal. And the coal-fired plants are increasingly antiquated and too costly to run. And so as alternatives are coming down, people just aren't automatically going to them. Power companies, regardless of whether we're in Paris Accords or not, are looking at the numbers and saying, coal is expensive, oil is expensive, gas is better, electricity is better, and we can actually do some things with solar and wind. And so companies are changing over. We need more concerted effort. It needs to be more than this. But the fact that one president in one country said, I'm out of Paris, doesn't mean that the rest of the world walked away, or the rest of the world stopped acting, or even the rest of the United States stopped acting. And so it needs to be pushed, and there's a lot of reversals that we've done that we need to re-reverse. But I think there is an understanding. I mean, our military has said that climate change is the greatest security threat to the US. Not Russia, not China, not. Those are all, they may be immediate or whatever, but the real threat is climate change. So we have our military saying that. The intelligence community has said it. Major corporations are starting to say it. So the fact that we have, a small group of people who are quite convinced that if we have a cold day, then obviously we don't have global warming, so we can stop worrying. A senator who will walk in with a snowball one day and say, see, I have a snowball, there is no global warming. Really? Honestly, you're an adult. And the compounding nature of climate change. Again, in the beginning, it was always talked about sea levels were rising or something like that, and you kind of go, okay, so Bangladesh goes underwater, Maldives goes underwater. Yeah, well, a NOAA scientist who I very much know and like, his family, he's an Arctic specialist, and his family lives in Houston. And when there was that hurricane and most of Houston went underwater, he very nicely explained to his parents, that water that you've got in your first floor now started life as part of the polar ice cap. It's now real. It's now the kinds of things that people are seeing: fires, hurricanes, cyclones, droughts. It's now a daily occurrence. And so I think that the focus is there. Reversing it, probably not. Slowing it down, possibly. Stopping some of the damage. For all of our destructiveness, we can also be extraordinarily innovative. That's the optimist side of me. The pessimist side, I can tell you, we have a great report that ISD did on the new Arctic. It's fantastic. I will make sure that the dean has a copy and send it out to people. It's horrifying, but it also has some hope.